So I think that that provides a nice transition to our next theme, which is really reimagining what to change to. Right. So yeah, we have to imagine a better state. We have to clearly articulate a better state in value delivery and how processes will actually work. Um, and so, you know, that becomes sometimes a difficult activity when you're stuck in a process yourself, or when you're extremely familiar with it, to your point about real ideas. So how do we understand what good looks like? You know, we can tell everybody to go forward. In fact, we just did. Um, we can yell forward, but how do we know what direction is forward? How do we know what to change to? And you brought up
Yeah.
the customer journey. So why don't you talk more about what that means in terms of shaping what to change to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most powerful thing is to actually speak to your customers, right? So I think wherever you have interaction with those customers, DMV is a great example. You get high throughput, high volume, um, surveys, conversations, focus groups, in the concept of an overall discussion about vision, where you really want to talk about how are we operating, and if we identified all of our stakeholders, because there are your end customer, citizen, stakeholders, but just like any other organization, public sector, they have a bunch of other stakeholders internal to the state and external. So in the DMV space, there are organizations where you'll share license information across states to help with fraud. There's a stakeholder. You've got to interact with the revenue agency. You interact with the child welfare agencies, so that you can impose sanctions on people that aren't fulfilling their duties, paying their taxes, supporting their families, things like that. Those are all stakeholders. So when you look at all those stakeholders and then you begin to ask the questions from their perspective, what do we do for them? And when we ask what we do for them, would we say that we're accurate, timely, efficient? Do we have the right documentation? You start going through that. That's a pretty robust analysis of your stakeholders, your customers, and the journeys they go through. And there's no way you go through that sort of analysis and don't come out with probably more work than you can handle, in terms of things to improve. But that's a rough framework for how to start that conversation.
Yeah, and ultimately that has to be the lead of any change, right? It's what are we delivering and to who, that being the customer of that delivery, and it really has to be how they experience it in a fundamental way. So, you know, we're often the worst people to evaluate how someone on the other end of the process experiences it,
Right, right.
right? Because we're very familiar with how everything works. And so whether you use resources from other agencies, whether you talk to customers, one of the most prolific teachers of entrepreneurs, a gentleman named Steve Blank, when he teaches a class, he makes his students talk to, I think, 50 customers each week, or they get kicked out of the class. Have to understand the customer. And there's a concept called direct observation that I think is a very powerful tool. It's really being able to observe how the customer experiences the service, the product, their experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes beyond asking. It's actually trying to observe how they work. Whether it's you know, using technology to track eye clicks, or see how straightforward, see how many back clicks they make before they find what they
Yeah.
need on a website, or it's just watching them walk into, say, a DMV, since we've used that experience, and do they know how it works? Are they very clear? Do they know where to go? And again, we take for granted how easy it is and how familiar we are with our own products and services. So a great example of the customer journey as it applies to direct observation is Toyota.
Yeah.
You know, when at Toyota, when any other automakers employees travel, you know, they have to rent a car, and out of loyalty, they always rent their own brand, right?
Right.
I spent time at Chrysler. I would travel, and I would always end up with a Chrysler product, and that certainly says a lot to brand loyalty and promoting the brand. But Toyota took a different approach. Their employees would actually have to rent a competitor's product. And they'd spend the first, X amount of minutes in the parking lot playing with all the dials and knobs and compartments. And then they'd use the product, of course, traveling. And they would write up a report that would go back to the design teams because it was them looking at it as a customer. I've bought this car, in this case, rented the car. I've used it for the first time. How did I experience the car? What did I like, not like? What was confusing? What was clear? And that became customer journey data to provide to the design process.
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant example. I mean, it's a perfect scenario, right? If we had the ability to step into the customer's shoes and go through what they go through, it would completely help. I think part of the challenge with that is that in many cases, to your point, we're experts. So if I ask one of my state tax and revenue clients to say, try and go fill out a tax form, well, they wouldn't have any problem with it, right? Because they designed it, they know how it works. So I think that at least in some situations where it's a service, you really need to get the customer to be candid with you and have those conversations. And it comes down to the mechanics of how you do that. Because in concept, it's a great idea. Customer journey, I want to go talk to 50 citizens across demographics and ask them, how was their experience filing their taxes this year? Like, get ready for a rough conversation, I'm sure. But that's really what you want to get to. The challenge is, how do you find those people? How do you get those people to spend some time with you and have those conversations? If you're in public sector services where there's kind of a retail component, like DMVs are pretty straightforward because you have a lot of traffic there and you can do surveys and you can observe how people come in and do they know exactly where to go? Do they wander around? Can you spend 5 minutes talking to them? All those things. Tax and revenue varies. Unemployment insurance varies. So there's a lot of areas where you have to be creative and say, how do I get that voice of customer? The other challenge that I think is out there is it's human nature that the people who have the most to say and potentially the most to complain about are the ones that are going to be potentially the ones that it's easier to talk to. So if you reached out and said, hey, we want to talk to people about their experiences, you're not going to get, out of 100 people, you're not going to get 99 that say, this is a great experience, I love it. I think just you have to be prepared to understand the baseline and kind of what you're going to get and tailor your questions to it. But I do think there's a very tactical piece of it as well.